Greg Collins here with Linemount.com. Today we're at the Linemount offices and we're discussing the 1967 Congressional Committee and how it impacted the design of the AR-15. So in the spring of 1967, Congress, in response to an increasing number of reports that soldiers in Vietnam were experiencing problems with the AR-15, they launched an investigation by forming the Ichord Committee, whose purpose was to look into what exactly was happening with the AR-15 and how to fix it. So how did things get so bad with the AR-15 that Congress felt like they needed to intervene, and what changes were made to the AR-15 as a result of this committee's findings? So the Ichord subcommittee began its investigation in May of 1967, but we really need to start a few months earlier in the fall of 1966. So the U.S. involvement in Vietnam really ramped up between 1965 and 1966. Over those 2 years, the number of troops in Vietnam more than doubled. It went from about 200,000 in the beginning of 1965 to about 500,000 by the end of 1966. So just a huge escalation during this 2-year period. And as more troops were placed on the ground in Vietnam, the number of reports about problems with the AR-15 began to increase as well. So in October of 1966, evidence of malfunctions and other issues with the M16 became so widespread that the commanding general in Vietnam, Westmoreland, requested help to determine what was going on. So a technical assistance team consisting of personnel from Army Weapons Command, and that was the organization at the time within the Army that was responsible for supply, distribution, maintenance, etc. of weapons, and they were known as WECOM, as well as representatives from the AR-15 manufacturer Colt, flew to Vietnam to investigate, and they were the team that went there was basically appalled at the condition of the rifles they were seeing. Now, quick note, at this point in 1967, what we have been calling the AR-15 was now more commonly referred to as the M16 because that was the military's designation for it. But look, just for simplicity, I will continue to refer to it as the AR-15. Anyway, the investigative team that Westmoreland had requested uncovered a bunch of issues, but they pointed mainly to poor maintenance of the rifles as the source of the problem. There were a few different reasons for the maintenance problems. So soldiers were never trained on how to maintain it, or they didn't have the right cleaning equipment, didn't have the correct manuals. The cleaning regimens were not enforced at the small unit level. They also pointed to some units that were lubricating their ammunition, which was not supposed to be done. Another issue identified was failure to replace worn or broken extractors and extractor springs. Now, that problem is actually tied to the lack of chrome-lined chambers, which we would hear more about in the Ichord Committee's findings, because less stress would be placed on the extractor if the chamber never got rusty by being chrome-lined. Anyway, the technical assistance team's findings, it was just a foreshadowing of what was to come with the Ichord Committee, who would identify a large number of other issues in the entire AR-15 program, not just what soldiers were experiencing at the tip of the spear. But even as the team that Westmoreland assembled to address the issues with the AR-15 was investigating and reporting their findings and just frantically trying to address the issues as quickly as possible for soldiers in combat in Vietnam, the greater U.S. public at large also started to get wind of the problems with the AR-15. Reports about the poor performance of the AR-15 by early 1967 had reached Congress, and it was by then a full-blown national scandal. Congressmen were receiving letters from Marines in Vietnam saying that their fellow Marines were dying because the AR-15s weren't working properly. Reports were just flooding in about malfunctions and jams, etc. All these reports were becoming better known to the public at large. So It was at this point in May of 1967 that the Ichord Subcommittee, formerly known as the Special Subcommittee on the M16 Rifle Program, was established in 1967 under the House Armed Services Committee, and it was chaired by Congressman Richard Ichord, hence the Ichord Committee. Its primary focus was to investigate the issues and controversies surrounding the AR-15 used during the Vietnam War, and as I mentioned, it becomes known as the Ichord Committee. So, the Ichord Committee conducted a series of hearings between May and August of 1967, and these hearings involved testimonies from military officials, manufacturers, and other stakeholders to address the malfunctions and reliability issues of the AR-15. Now, these activities were pivotal in identifying and addressing the problems associated with it, and it led to subsequent improvements in its design and maintenance protocols, etc. Anyway, the Ichord Committee released its final report on the AR-15 in October of 1967, and the report is pretty damning. It paints a picture of just incompetence at best, and at worst, grotesque negligence bordering on criminal negligence. The report is almost 600 pages, and it's pretty exhaustive, and it actually provides a pretty good history of the AR-15's developmental history. I'll include a link to the actual report in the show notes if you're interested. So, there's just a laundry list of problems the Ichord Committee identified with how the AR-15 was implemented. We're only going to discuss the primary 5 issues. The first was the gunpowder being used. The committee identified that there was basically an unauthorized change in gunpowder for the cartridges that were used in Vietnam in the AR-15. The AR-15 was initially designed and tested for use with IMR 4475 extruded powder, which was developed by DuPont for military applications decades earlier. The IMR stands for Improved Military Rifle. Now, that powder burns cleaner and leaves less residue, which causes fewer malfunctions in the AR-15. However, this powder was not initially used in Vietnam, but instead a ball powder called WC-846 was used, and that left significantly more residue and fouling in the AR-15 and caused more frequent jams. Now, there are actually some advantages to ball powder in that it's faster and less dangerous to manufacture than IMR, and it also doesn't degrade over time as quickly as IMR. But either way, the committee criticized the Army for failing to adequately test the rifle with the new ammunition. With regards to the testing issue, when the AR-15 was initially designed, as mentioned, it was tested with the cleaner burning IMR powder. But during large-scale production of the AR-15 that started in 1964, acceptance testing of the rifles continued to use the cleaner burning IMR powder, even though Colt actually advised the Army that the AR-15s would fail the acceptance tests if they were used with the ball powder. So this is just obviously crazy because the vast majority of ammunition being used in Vietnam had ball powder. So Colt was using IMR powder for rifle acceptance testing, but soldiers in Vietnam were using the dirtier burning ball powder in combat. The second problem the Ichord Committee identified was the same one that Westmoreland's technical assistance team identified in the fall of 1966, which is that soldiers were not equipped or trained with the proper cleaning equipment. In some cases, soldiers were actually over-lubricating the weapon, and that caused an even greater rapid buildup of fouling. The third problem the Ichord Committee identified is that there was a lack of chrome plating in the chamber. And the chambers in Vietnam, a large number of them quickly became rusted and pitted in the hot, humid environment. So now remember, Westmoreland's team pointed the finger at not replacing broken extractors, but excess wear and tear on the extractor is because the chamber is pitted with rust. So they kind of pointed the finger at the result of the chrome lining not existing in the chamber. The fourth problem the Ichord Committee report discusses is the use of a new type of buffer that improved reliability, and it should have been distributed quicker to combat units in Vietnam, and it basically criticizes the Army for, and I quote, lackadaisical manner in which it was implemented. The fifth problem that the Ichord Committee identified, I will sum up as operational dysfunction within both the Army and at Colt. And there was just dysfunction all over the place. I'm just going to mention a few things that the committee notes. They said the Army didn't test the AR-15 enough with the new ammunition, and that the Army was aware of the problems associated with the ball powder as early as March 1964. And the Army had a shortage of AR-15s for training. The committee questioned the validity of the testing requirements for accuracy performance, where the temperature ranges from negative 65 degrees to 125 degrees, and that in turn led to a change in barrel twist from 1 in 14 to 1 in 12, which according to the report reduced its lethality by up to 40%, which is crazy, and we'll get to that later in the future. Colt also attempted to downplay the severity of the problems and didn't implement necessary design changes like chrome plating the chamber quick enough. Also, the Ichord Committee said Colt was overcharging the Army for the rifles, and they said the Army should have obtained production rights from Colt. Also, the report calls out potentially unethical behavior by Major General Lind, who was in charge of Army Weapons Command, that's WECOM, during the original negotiations with Colt for procurement of the AR-15. So what happened was General Lind approved the contract with Colt that was negotiated, then he retired from the Army, and shortly thereafter went to work for Colt. The report just goes on and on and on like this, which is, it's a pretty damning report. Anyway, so what changes were made to the AR-15 as a result of the Ichord Committee? Because of the Ichord Committee and public pressure, 1967 marks another key inflection point in the design and quality of AR-15s. So put yourself in the position as a ranking officer in WECOM or as an executive at Colt. Suddenly, in early 1967, the entire country, including Congress, is looking at you under a microscope and implying that you might be responsible for providing our combat soldiers defective rifles. So all this attention put WECOM and in turn Colt's feet to the fire to fix the AR-15. So the pressure on the Army and Colt to improve the AR-15 just reached extreme levels in early 1967. So it's not really a surprise that a lot of the most critical improvements to the AR-15 started to be implemented at this time. Also, now that Congress was investigating what was happening, it was possible not just that Colt might lose future contracts, but people involved in the AR-15 project might be in some kind of trouble. No one really knew what the Ichord Committee was going to find or what they would recommend. Now remember, the AR-15 program by this point had grown over a decade into 1967 into just a sprawling operation that involved a large number of different government and private organizations and contracts and procurement managers and manufacturers and contractors and subcontractors and people and personalities just across geography and time. So there was a lot to look into. So you have different organizations that made a lot of changes over time, and you have Colt and you have the Army. So what does the Army do? The Army improves its training regarding cleaning and provisioning of cleaning equipment for the AR-15. It's the main thing that they do. Colt, meanwhile, makes a lot of improvements to the AR-15, and these improvements a lot of people tend to overlook because what we see in Vietnam in the pictures is that the appearance of the rifles look virtually the same throughout the war. But there's some critical improvements that are hidden because the changes that took place in 1967 were all internal, or they're related to cleaning methods, so you don't really see them. So here are some of the changes. The first were the coatings. In September of 1967, all new all new production AR-15 rifles and spare barrels were manufactured with chromed chambers. So there's a reason that leading into 1967, we see a lot of reports of worn or broken extractors, stuck cases in the chamber, etc. But in the years afterwards, you rarely hear about that. The chrome chambers, it's just a better design. Later on, both the chamber and the bore were chrome lined, and that improved the things also. Gunpowder. The second big change was the switch from the original ball powder WC-846 that was causing a lot of problems with the excessive fouling to a cleaner burning ball powder called WC-844, although that change actually didn't happen until 1970. But once the improved ball powder was introduced, the amount of fouling declined. And lastly, quality control. By the end of 1967, on top of all those other improvements I mentioned, some more quality assurance processes were implemented on the AR-15 at the factory before the AR-15s were accepted by the military. This included checking various critical dimensions and functionality of all the rifles, and also just more exacting inspections of each barrel, including magnetic particle inspections and pressure testing. Now, you may ask, hey, these seem like fairly basic quality assurance processes. It's concerning what exactly they were doing before this time, and my answer is yes. I'm glad they fixed it. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video on the history of the AR-15, Part 4, Ichord Committee. If you liked what you saw, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Thank you for watching.